At a very basic level, the Layers panel in Illustrator allows us to divide our artwork up into sections. That way we can more easily work within a more complicated file. However, there's a tremendous amount of hidden power inside the Layers panel that really helps us work with just about any file whatsoever, and no additional work is necessary. In this example here, we do have 3 layers. These are the exact same 3 layers that we created in the previous movie. The document that I'm working with here, if you want to follow along, is called Object Hierarchy. You'll find that inside of Chapter 9 of the exercise files. And let me go ahead and move this just a little bit over here to the right here so we can get a better idea of what's happening. I'm going to expand this particular Layers panel so that we can kind of see a lot more of it. In a minute you'll see why. Notice that each of the layers themselves have a little triangle, what we call a disclosure triangle, or some people refer to them as twirlies or twirl downs. Let's start off here on the bottom with the background layer. We know that the background layer, as we saw before, consists of one particular rectangle, or one path that we created, that's filled with a gradient. If I go ahead in the Layers panel right here, and I click on that little twirl down, I'll see that the path exists here. Now, even though this path is listed here in the Layers panel, this itself is not a layer. Take a look at how the background layer itself over here that I have has a gray background, but the path is sitting on a white background. Well, basically, the Layers panel itself has the ability to show me not just layers, but also objects. In fact, all the objects that exist inside of a file. And I can distinguish the difference between paths or objects and layers by seeing what color the background is inside of the Layers panel. In fact, let's go ahead and click on the twirl downs for the separate objects layer and also for the grouped element layer. I'll click down over here in the blank area so that I have no layers selected. As a quick overall view, I can see right away that I have 3 layers in my document. I have the grouped element layer, the separate objects layer, and the background layer, again identified each by gray backgrounds. The white backgrounds here indicate objects that exist inside of those layers. The importance of this is twofold. First of all, I have the ability now to see every single object that exists inside of my file right here in the Layers panel. And in addition, I also have the ability to visually see the hierarchy or the way that the objects are built inside of my file. Remember that everything inside of Illustrator is built from the bottom up. So I see that in this document, this path comes first on the bottom, it's the background. Then I have this particular path here, then this path, this group, this path, for example, and then moving forward. Now that we understand that, let's take another look over here. I see that in my separate objects layer, which is this element here that's made of many different objects, there is a group that exists there. If I click on the twirl down for that group, I see the elements that exist inside of that group. In fact, that group right here is the words surf, but it's a different compound shape that exists right there for the letter S, U, R, and F. Let me go ahead and close that for a second here. Take a look at the grouped element. I now see that there's a group. These elements now live inside of a single group. And if I click on the twirl down, I'll see that the same elements that make up the separate objects are now put inside of this overall group. We discussed before how you could use isolation mode to basically jump into a group and edit objects within that group. We also know that we can bring objects to the front or to the back of other objects, again within a single layer. Well, rather than always have to travel up to the object menu to change the stacking order of objects, you can do things directly through the Layers panel. For example, right now this word Hawaii is sitting above this particular red path, which is this word right here, Hawaii, over this red path right here. However, if I take this layer right here, or this object within the Layers panel, and drag it beneath that red path, we'll see that I've now changed the stacking order. It's still there, but I had to send it behind that particular object. And I can undo that or change it by simply taking that and dragging it above as well. But perhaps most important of all is how you could work with appearances and layers together. I explained before that when we had this particular element here that we grouped together and we applied the drop shadow now is applied to the group element, which means that if I were to select this group right now and choose to ungroup it, the drop shadow would disappear. Now, the reality is that when you're working inside of a graphic and you select a particular object, you see it has a drop shadow. How do you know if that drop shadow belongs to the group or not? Well, when you use the Layers panel, there's a really easy way to tell. Take a look over here. I'm going to deselect this piece of artwork right now. Take a look on the far right side of the Layers panel, and you'll notice that each layer or object has a little circle here. Some of these circles are hollow, while some of them are filled with a gradient. These circles are called target circles, and depending on the way that they look, they identify to us as designers whether or not those particular elements have appearances, or I would say complex appearances applied to them. Let's explain. I'll bring up the appearance panel here because these things go hand in hand. Let's close the graphic styles here. So I have the appearance panel and I have the Layers panel here side by side. Let's move this over just a little bit so we can see a little bit more what we're dealing with. We know that the path itself that exists right here is a regular path that's filled with a gradient. Since it has a single fill and a single stroke, that particular element has a basic appearance. Any object or layer that appears in the Layers panel with a hollow circle identifies that object or layer as having a basic appearance. However, anytime you see a shaded target circle, that means that that particular object or layer has a complex appearance applied to it. And in fact, without having to do too much detective work, we can easily take a look at this file right now and see what is going on. This group right here has the drop shadow on it because if I look right over here at the group, I see that the group has a target circle that is shaded, meaning that this group has some kind of a complex appearance on it. However, each of the objects inside of that group all have basic appearances, which means that they obviously can have drop shadows on them. In comparison, take a look at the separate objects layer. The layer itself has a regular target circle, meaning that the layer itself has a basic appearance. However, each of the individual objects within that layer obviously have complex appearances, meaning that I might assume that they all have drop shadows on them. You can see this very clearly simply by clicking on the target circle itself. If I go here to the group and I click on the target circle, I am manually targeting that particular group. Now, Illustrator employs something called smart targeting, which means if I click on a group, Illustrator automatically targets the group for me, thinking that if I want to apply an effect, I want it to be applied to the overall group. However, I can manually target anything inside of Illustrator by clicking on its target circle. For example, clicking on this word Hawaii right here on the target circle here identifies that this text is now selected and targeted, and that particular object has a drop shadow applied to it. So it's obvious that the Layers panel contains a tremendous amount of information about how my file is actually built. And even if you don't actually use layers in your artwork, the ability to see the object hierarchy in your file and the appearances that are applied to them make the Layers palette a very valuable tool.